The Abolition of Work is an essay by philosopher Bob Black. In this essay, Black argues that work deprives us of our freedom, devalues us as human beings, and is ultimately unnecessary for society to function. Therefore, he concludes, work both can and ought to be abolished. Nearly 40 years have passed since the Abolition of Work was first published, and needless to say, Black's vision of a work-free society has yet to be realized. Even so, there appears to be a growing number of people, particularly but not exclusively younger people, who are sympathetic to the idea of doing away with work. And for many of those who hold to such a view, Black's text is held up as essential reading. As a younger person and a working person myself, I decided to check out what Bob Black had to say. After reading and rereading The Abolition of Work, I can understand why some people might find this view attractive. However, after carefully considering his argument, I can find no reason to accept his conclusion. Over the next few videos, I will try to explain what Black means by abolishing work, why he thinks we need to do so, and why I think his argument ultimately fails to clearly demonstrate that an abolition of work is necessary or even desirable. I want to spend a little bit of time with this word abolition. What does it generally mean with respect to social practices and institutions? How is abolition different from, say, reformation? And why does Black choose abolition over reform? Well, that's a question we'll be able to answer, I think, better if we prime ourselves a little bit first with some basic understanding of each of these terms. Generally, when someone calls for the abolition of some social institution or practice, the implication is that it is fundamentally problematic. To abolish something means to remove it completely. So if someone calls for the abolition of something, the implication is that this thing is problematic in all possible worlds, meaning there is no sense in which it could not be a problem. It is through and through a problem. One example of a social institution for which abolition seems to be really the only logical solution that I can think of would be slavery. Slavery was not a social practice or institution which admits of being reformable. Unlike abolition, to reform some social institution implies that it is not through and through a problem, but that there is at least one or more components that need to be excised. So the idea is that you can improve this practice or institution without taking it away, without eradicating it, removing it completely. That's not something that could have been done for slavery. Slavery is completely wrong and will always be wrong. So there's no way you could reform slavery to try and make it better. That it just doesn't admit of being capable of being reformed. There are some social institutions or practices which I think are much better candidates for reform than abolition. And one of those would be psychiatric hospitals. Psychiatric hospitals are no strangers to scandals involving abuse of patients. But abuse of patients is, of course, not an essential component of a psychiatric hospital. In fact, I think you could actually make the argument that if a psychiatric hospital has a problem with abusing its patients or mistreating them in some way, then excising, for example, the staff members who are doing these horrible things would actually bring that hospital closer to a more perfect realization of its aim. Given that it's a hospital, its aim probably has something to do with taking care of people, not mistreating them. So the point is, you can remove, for example, staff members at a hospital that are doing bad things and improve the conditions at the hospital without removing the hospital altogether. Thus, there seems to be a connection between the way we conceive of things which we take to be problematic and how we think they should be dealt with. If we conceive of something as being fundamentally problematic, then it follows that abolition is going to be a much more logical solution. On the other hand, if we conceive of something as being composed of certain problematic elements, which could be excised or removed, reform seems to be the best offer. If I've established that some connection exists between what we conceive of things which we take to be problematic and what kinds of actions we prescribe to deal with them, then hopefully at least this much is clear. Whatever Bob Black's conception of work is, it must be such that work is fundamentally problematic, hence why he would think that only a complete abolition thereof can have any meaningful effect on the way we live. How then does Black conceive of work? Black defines work in two ways. In the first place, he defines work as something we are compelled or forced to do, rather than something we do freely. Presumably, Black takes freedom to be very important, a basic right, something we all deserve. Thus, if work deprives us of our freedom, insofar as it is something we are forced or compelled to do, then work essentially deprives us of a basic right, deprives us of something we all deserve. In that case, then work would be, on its face, ethically unjustifiable. In the second place, Black defines work as something that we do for extrinsic ends, which is to say, work is something we do for the sake of someone or something else. And there's a couple of ways we can look at that. First way we can look at that is that work is something that we do to satisfy needs or desires which are not our own. It could be the needs or desires of the customer or the boss or whatever. But maybe those needs and desires aren't our own. For example, when I worked at a retail store and my job was to straighten things on the shelves, well, I did not need or desire the things to be straightened on the shelves, but the customers needed or desired them. Or I guess you could say my bosses probably needed or desired it more. And they needed or desired it to be straight on the shelves because their bosses needed to make sure that they were telling me to make sure the boxes and things were straight on the shelves. So it's like this never-ending chain of other people's needs or desires that were satisfying. So, okay, all right, I can kind of picking up what Black's putting down here. There's another sense, though, and this is the sense that I think Black really tries to drive home, which can be a little bit complex. But there's another sense in which work is an extrinsic activity, and that is insofar as the activity of work itself, doing that activity doesn't do anything for us. Whatever we get out of the activity of work always comes after the work is done. So, for example, why did I, when I was in high school and working for the retail store, straighten the stuff on the shelves? Well, it wasn't just because I wanted to please my bosses. Some of them, they were pretty nice, some of them not so much. But it was also because I wanted to get a paycheck. I wanted to get money so I could put gas in my car, buy cigarettes, buy coffees and any energy drinks, whatever else I was into in high school. So there was something at the end of the working day waiting for me, or at the end of the 2-week period. We got 2-week paychecks. That is an extrinsic end that I'm working towards. The activity of straightening the things on the shelves was not very satisfying in and of itself. This, I think, becomes much, much clearer when we contrast work, as Black defines it, with the way he defines play. For Black, play is the counterpart to work, and Black's definition of play is also very interesting. Like his definition of work, Black's notion of play appears to be twofold. In the first place, he defines play as something that we engage in freely. And in the second place, he defines play as something which we engage in for intrinsic purposes. It is something which we do for its own sake. Whatever we get out of playing, like playing a game or creating or making love, these are some of the examples Black uses in his essay. There's nothing that we're working towards at the end of after having completed these activities. These are not tasks. Making love, painting a painting, singing a song, dancing a dance, playing a game. These are not things that are tasks which must be completed in order to get some kind of reward afterwards. It is something that is done for the sake of doing it. There's some intrinsic good and intrinsic enjoyment in performing these activities. And Black thinks that that is completely contradictory to what work is. I don't think most people would disagree. I think most people would say, yeah, working and playing are different. What makes Black unique is that he says, yeah, and we should always be playing, and we should never be working. That's an interesting argument. That's something that I can't resist analyzing as a philosopher. I have to dig deeper into that. I really want to understand why Black takes such an unusual view. It's not just that Black dislikes working and prefers to play, although I'm sure he does, and I'm sure a lot of us do. It's much more than that for Black. Play, on Black's view, is something that we all need. We all need, as human beings, to be engaging in activities which are done purely for their own sake. There's just something intrinsically necessary to us as human beings in that sort of activity. And there is something that we lose by engaging in activities for extrinsic ends. There's something almost dehumanizing about that. Because presumably when we participate in an activity for extrinsic ends, we are ourselves becoming a means to those ends. At least that's how some philosophers would look at it. Black doesn't actually come right out and say that, so I'm trying to be cautious here, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he seems to be nudging up very closely to that sort of view, which would be a very Kantian view, I suppose, although of course I'm not aware that Kant took such a view to work as Black did. If it's true that play is more important to human beings than work, Black thinks that this should be reflected in the way we structure our societies. Yet, in every present mode of society, from capitalist to communist, work remains a dominant activity in people's lives. And for Bob Black, this is plainly indefensible. This view of work is surprising, and it is one which sets Black apart from most other critics who have dealt with the subject of work. Karl Marx, for instance, contended that problems such as the exploitation of workers and their estrangement from their labor were the necessary outcome of working under capitalism, but not that they were the necessary outcome of working itself. Quite the contrary, in fact. Marx believed that these problems associated with work would naturally resolve once the root problem was addressed. And for Marx, of course, that root problem was capitalism. For Black, however, work is the root cause, and as such it is not capitalism which must be abolished for him, but work itself. Since Black takes work to be the root cause of all our troubles, changing the economic system in which we work is about as effective as changing seats on a sinking ship. So long as there is work, Black insists there will be problems. Whether we're working in a capitalist system, communist system, or some other kind. The same goes for more localized measures of reform. Labor unions who can negotiate better wages for workers, oversight communities who can make sure that our workplaces are safer, laws which better protect employees against discrimination and harassment. None of these, on Black's view, can address what is the root problem, work. For Black, all work is exploitative. All work is unfair. Whether we make a lot of money or barely enough to live, whether we worry constantly about harassment or discrimination, whether the thought never crosses our mind, whether we work in a dangerous environment or a safe one. The notion of reforming work, for Black, is simply inadmissible. Only a complete abolition of work can have any meaningful effect on the way we live, and this follows from the way that he defines work. Work is always, for him, forced, and it is always extrinsic, and as such, It is a deprivation of things which are integral to what makes us human beings: free, autonomous, and needing and deserving, therefore, to engage in activities for their own sake. Besides depriving us of our freedom and devaluing us as human beings, Black also believes that work is harmful. In fact, Black credits work with virtually every form of suffering you could imagine. Everything from personal injuries to our bodies to environmental harms. What's interesting about this is Black kind of covers all the bases. He covers how work is harmful to us directly as well as indirectly. And he also talks about some of the ways that work harms not just us, human beings, but the world that we live in. He really doesn't leave much out in terms of where work's harm leaves its mark. Some of the direct harms that Black identifies that work has on us are that work is hazardous to your health. Even if you aren't killed while working, he says you might be killed while going to work. Some of the less direct impacts that work has on us, he says work leads to a kind of cretinization. Like, for example, Black says if you work a boring job, you're going to become a boring person. This one's interesting, where he says that work usurps our time. It means it takes up so much of our time. And that is interesting to me because he's talking about work affecting us even when we're not at work. So there's kind of this idea that even when the clock stops, even when you go home from work, you're so exhausted from it, you don't have time to pursue any of these activities that Black thinks we should be pursuing in, like dancing and painting or whatever. Black even goes so far as to imply that work is responsible for the energy crisis, environmental crisis, and that by abolishing work, we would also at least make a pretty good dent in some of these other problems. Now, what's interesting about this argument from harm is, first of all, that Black introduces it about halfway through his essay, and that he introduces it as sort of an olive branch to people of a more utilitarian mindset than he seems to have. And again, trying not to pigeonhole Black into any one particular school of thought, but I think it's fairly obvious that he follows definitely not a utilitarian point of view. And in fact, I think he kind of comes out and says as much himself. About halfway through The Abolition of Work, Black starts to introduce this argument from harm, and he leads it off with this sentence. He says, if these objections, informed by the love of liberty, fail to persuade humanists of a utilitarian or even paternalist turn, there are others which they cannot disregard. And then he goes on to the whole work is hazardous to your health. Even if you don't die at work, you'll die while going to work. Very bleak picture he's painting here. But what's interesting about this is he seems to have introduced this argument as kind of a rhetorical device. And the question is, does this actually support his broader case against work or not? That may be kind of a surprising question, particularly for those who have read this essay before. That's something that we'll want to revisit later, because I think it is an important question to ask, is whether this argument from harm supports or is even compatible with his much more overt arguments from, as he calls it, the love of liberty. We'll return to that idea later. For now, let's take a look at the last piece of Black's argument against work. Suppose we agreed with everything Black has said up to this point. Suppose we agree that work is, by definition, something we are forced to do against our will. And suppose we agree that work is the cause of almost every harm imaginable, from personal injuries on the job to depleted energy after the long working day, even to harms done to the environment through pollution, deforestation, and so on. Now, if all that's true, then perhaps Black's case against work is a strong one. Perhaps we shouldn't work after all. There's just one problem. Even if everything Black has said about work is true, we still need to work, don't we? As harmful as it might be, as immoral as it might be, work is something we need to do to survive. What would happen to me, to you, if we stopped working? What would happen to all of society? How would anything get done if everyone stopped working? So perhaps, maybe we could say that work is a necessary evil. Well, here's where the last piece of Black's argument comes in. For Black, work is not a necessary evil. In fact, on his view, work is not necessary at all. Black rejects the notion that work is necessary for a functioning society. The only sense in which he can construe of work as being necessary is insofar as society has made it so. But if that's the case, then our need to work is not, strictly speaking, a need at all. In philosophy, something is necessary if it could not be otherwise. That is, if it couldn't have been different. But that's not how Black understands any of the present modes of society on offer. From his perspective, neither capitalism, socialism, communism, nor any other ism, other than presumably some variant of anarchism, is itself necessary to our survival, and least of all with respect to our happiness. So for Black, if work serves any actual function, any purpose, then it is to maintain order. Of course, maintaining order in this sense essentially amounts to maintaining whatever mode of society one finds themselves in. And for Black, none of these societies, none of the ways that we've structured our societies are worth maintaining anyway. So he wonders then, why not structure our societies differently? Why not structure our society in a way which does not require forcing people to do things against their will? Some other kind of society which allows people to pursue activities which are meaningful. In fact, rather than plunge society into chaos, as probably many would assume, Black believes that abolishing work will actually lead to a much healthier society, one where people can live more fulfilling, more meaningful lives. How can we better understand this idea of the need to work being a need only in the very loosest sense of the word? Well, I think of the phrase, "I need a cigarette." Now, that might be a phrase that sounds familiar to you if you're a smoker, or if you know somebody who smokes, or if you have smoked in the past. That is a phrase that I can definitely relate to because I've been a smoker in the past. And, of course, the interesting thing about that phrase is it's false. I mean, nobody literally needs a cigarette. Nobody actually needs nicotine to survive. But if you've ever been addicted to nicotine, then you know that's certainly the way it feels, doesn't it? It feels like you need something to live. It's very uncomfortable when you're deprived of that chemical. And what's so curious about it is that uncomfortable feeling would never have been introduced into our bodies if we had never introduced the chemical in the first place. See, if you never introduce an addictive chemical into your body, well, then your body can't become addicted to it. And kind of in the same way, it seems like Black is saying if the particular ways in which we've structured societies had not been introduced, and had therefore not introduced this so-called need to work, then that need to work would itself have never arisen. The elephant in the room here, the big question that's kind of circling around this discussion of work not being necessary, I think is the question of, well, how are we going to actually accomplish something like that? Building a new society usually takes a little bit of work. Maintaining a new society certainly takes some work. And even if not everybody participates, maybe we do it like the utopian socialists. We have some intellectuals who do all the planning, and then we have the kind of the worker bees who sort of do the actual revolutionizing. Even if we did something like that, it seems like there's going to be some work involved at some point. It's just hard to imagine not having to exert effort to attain some goal at some point in the future. Even if we do successfully set up this new and improved world that Black is designing for us. Well, Black has an answer to our questions. If it's not already clear, the preceding questions all follow from the assumption that abolishing work entails abolishing all kinds of productive activity, including activities which would seem to be necessary for any society's maintenance or function. Black seems to anticipate this, and so in the last stage of his argument, Black explains what abolishing work is and what it isn't. Black imagines that abolishing work involves two things. In the first place, he says, abolishing work involves getting rid of so-called useless jobs. And this is what he terms the quantitative sense in which work should be abolished. That is, the sense in which abolishing work involves reducing the amount of productive activity that's being done. Most jobs, Black argues, are useless. That is to say, they produce nothing we actually need or desire. They exist only to maintain the status quo, and we would not really be losing anything of value in getting rid of them. Some of the examples of these so-called useless jobs that Black considers useless are as follows. Black writes, right off the bat, we can liberate tens of millions of salesmen, soldiers, managers, cops, stockbrokers, clergymen, bankers, lawyers, teachers, landlords, security guards, admin, and everyone who works for them. We'll want to come back to that list later. Now, Black concedes that some, if not many jobs which currently exist, could be salvaged, as he puts it, but only to whatever extent that they can be transformed from work, that is, something that's done out of force, into play, that is, something that people do freely and for its own sake, or at least for the purpose of attaining something we genuinely need or desire. This, then, is what he terms the qualitative sense in which work should be abolished, meaning that for whatever jobs, whatever activities remain which are genuinely needful or desired, that those who wish to engage in such activities can do so of their own will and for ends which are actually desired or needed. Presumably, although Black doesn't give very many examples of jobs he doesn't consider useless, but presumably one of the biggest areas that he would consider necessary and which could be salvaged would be agriculture, which he describes as the primary sector of an economy. Agriculture does seem pretty important, so it's good to know Black intends to keep agriculture in his utopian paradise that he's building. Thus, Black does not think that his definition of work entails an abolition of all activity, least of all productive activity, but that we would instead first eliminate those activities which produce nothing of real value, and that for whatever activities remain which are valuable, either because they are enjoyable or because they are in some way related to our survival, that we would engage in these activities in a way that is qualitatively different from the way in which we would normally engage in work. And that is essentially what Black is driving at when he says he wants to do away with the notion of a job or an occupation. Furthermore, Black goes on to assert that his definition of play does not entail, as he calls it, frivolity, meaning it is possible to perform some activities which are necessary and which are beneficial to the good of society in such a way that is qualitatively different from the way we would perform these activities if they were jobs or work or something you had to do. In other words, we could, in theory, perform whatever tasks are actually necessary, and we could perform them by choice and out of actual need. What about people who like their jobs? Like, I have a friend who's a house painter, and he's been a house painter for a long time. And he's told me many times that he gets a lot of fulfillment out of the work that he does. If we implemented Black's plan today, would my friend have to stop painting houses tomorrow? Black would say no. Because remember, Black says that abolishing work only means that we get rid of jobs which no one needs or wants. So if someone wants their house to be painted, and my friend wants to do it, Black would say, go right ahead. But turn that work into play. Do it freely and for its own sake. But if you already enjoy what you do, then aren't you already doing that? Aren't you already, if you enjoy your job, doing it freely and for its own sake? Aren't you getting some enjoyment out of the activity itself? Aren't you doing it by choice? Black would push back on all of that. First, he would say, if you're working so that you can get money in order to buy food, clothes, shelter, then on its face, you're not doing it just for its own sake. You're not doing it just because you like doing it. You're also doing it because you get things that you need to survive. So he would say you're not doing it for its own sake in that respect. He would also say that you're not even doing it freely. Because if you were to stop working, like if my friend were to stop painting houses, well, eventually the money would run out, the food would run out, the house, the clothes, and so on. Black construes that as basically being forced to work, because if you weren't working, you would be deprived of these things you need for survival. And so if it's any kind of choice that you're making to work, from Black's perspective, it's about as much of a choice as giving your wallet to somebody who's robbing you at knife point and saying your money or your life, which of course is a forced choice, so really not much of a choice at all. Now that's a pretty bleak picture, and it's one that I know for a fact my friend wouldn't agree with, and I imagine there's a lot of people who enjoy their jobs who would not agree with Black's understanding of what constitutes doing something freely or for its own sake. Of course, like a good critical philosopher, Black gives us a pretty clear idea of what he thinks is wrong with the world as it currently is, and he gives us a more or less clear idea of what he thinks ought to be done about what's wrong with the world. But he doesn't give us so much of a clear picture of what his new work-free society would actually look like on, say, a day-to-day basis. It's kind of fuzzy from that point on, in terms of if we implemented his ideas today, what the world would look like tomorrow, not so apparent. So we've got to work with what we've been given. So, to review, work is something that we are forced to do, per Black's definition, and it is something we perform solely for extrinsic ends. But what human beings need, and what we deserve, is to be able to act without being coerced, and to be able to engage in activities which are intrinsically worthwhile. These are, in a word, rights, which human beings all have by virtue of being human. Hence, there is no ethical justification for requiring people to work, since working infringes upon these rights. Anything that needs doing could be done in a world without work. And in fact, most of the stuff that's being done in the world with work is not necessary or desired. If work were somehow necessary for society to function, then perhaps this infringement upon our rights and the many harms that Black thinks work inflicts upon us and the world could be seen as a necessary evil or a necessary sacrifice which we must all make for the greater good. But as it stands, Black does not think work is necessary. Hence, we cannot justify work on either the grounds that it is morally permissible, nor on the grounds that it is practically necessary. In a world without work, human beings will be able to flourish, to thrive, to live more full, more meaningful lives. And what is even better, Black thinks we will lose nothing of value if we do away with work. We will really lose nothing and gain everything. There is no ethical justification for work, nor is work necessary. Therefore, Black concludes work can, and in fact must, be abolished. This concludes the summary of Bob Black's The Abolition of Work, as I understand it. What I've tried to do so far is to present Bob Black's argument as charitably as I can. I've tried to summarize the main points of his argument, try to gain a deeper understanding of his line of reasoning, which takes him to the conclusion that work should be abolished. Along the way, I raised a few questions and objections that I thought were likely to be elicited upon a first read of this paper. However, you'll notice that none of these objections were really able to rebut or refute Black's case against work. For every objection raised here, we could find either an explicit response in Black's paper, or we could infer what his response would probably be based on our reading. Thus, my aim so far has been twofold. In the first place, it's to gain a deeper understanding of this rather unusual but challenging text, as well as to clear a space for what I think are more pressing objections, many of which I have not seen raised elsewhere. Now, this might sound strange, but my hope is that by the end of this talk, someone who already agrees with Bob Black will not have had their views changed. That's because I think that presenting opposing views charitably, or at least as charitably as possible, is an essential prerequisite for any meaningful critique to take place. Well, that's not just my opinion. That's basically the standard for critiquing someone else's work in philosophy. And to be quite frank, I actually found Black's paper to be fairly lacking in that department. That is, in faithful representations of those he disagrees with, for example. And I suppose that's probably a good place to begin in terms of talking about some of the other problems that I saw. The next talk will consist of 3 or 4 methodological problems that I see in the abolition of work, which I think deserve a little bit of attention. And my aim will be to kind of try and present Black's argument in a bit more of a critical light than I have so far. I hope you'll join me. I hope you're enjoying this so far, and thanks.